Amen. I love my parents very much. But when I was a kid, they used to drive me crazy. They were always stopping me from doing all sorts of brilliant activities. When I was a kid, I wanted to stick a metal fork in an outlet, and they would take the fork away from me. I would want to do nothing but eat pizza and cinnamon rolls, my two absolute favorite foods in the world, and my mother would insist on vegetables. And then my friends and I used to do all sorts of things on our bikes. First, we learned how to ride with no hands. But that was actually pretty easy. We were pretty good at that. We could ride with no hands. We could even go around corners and stuff. So then we started to push the envelope a little bit, right? And so we would put our feet up on that middle bar and stand up on the bikes. So that was not a good idea. But probably the greatest thing that we ever did as children was the ramp. I grew up on a street with a cul-de-sac, one of those streets with like a little circle, and it was on a really steep hill. And so brilliant engineers that we would pile up a bunch of 2x4s and put a big plank up against it. And we would pedal down that hill as fast as we could, and we would hit that board going as fast as we can and launch ourselves into the air. And that's as far as we planned. It wasn't until the first kid was like flipping through the air that we were like, oh, this might be a bad idea. Now, why would my mother and my father keep me from doing such well thought out activities? Because they loved me, right? They didn't want me to die. I know a lot of people confuse love with happiness. A phrase that we hear a lot in our culture is, I love them so much, I just want them to be happy. But happiness is not the same as love. Don't ever love somebody too much to stop them from destroying themselves. In every type of relationship, parent, child, brother, sister, cousins, friends, schoolmates, church, work, every relationship, when love finds sin, confrontation is inevitable. Today is the last week in our sermon series called The David Files, where we have been looking in depth at the Old Testament character of King David. And what we're going to find is that when love finds sin, confrontation is inevitable. And today we're going to talk about that confrontation. As I mentioned last week, sin is not an isolated event. It makes ripples into our lives. And so verse 1, it says, chapter 12, verse 1, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. And so there's two quick things that we can see right from the very beginning. At the end of last week, we told the story of David and Bathsheba and how she was a married woman, but he wanted her, so he took her, and then she gets pregnant, and then there's a whole cover-up story, which turned into a murder plot and all this stuff. But at the end of that story, David gets away with it, right? He's the king, so he orchestrates this murder so that it happens by happenstance, and he can write it off as a casualty of war, but he gets away with it. He moves on with his life. And so what we see right at the beginning is that avoiding the consequences now doesn't mean anything in God's eyes. God is everywhere, and God is all-knowing. There's nothing God doesn't see. Whether you're in church or out of church, there is nothing that we can get away with. God knows it all. Now, the second thing I want to point out is that we have introduced a new character, Nathan. Now, Nathan was the prophet of Israel. He was the voice of God. And so God sends Nathan to approach David and say, I know what you did, and it was wrong. I know what you did. Nathan is going to confront David because God sent him. And so the key part here is that God judges, Nathan confronts. Okay, Nathan's job was confrontation, not judgment. To be clear, in our lives, we are not the judge. Only God can judge. Now, I love the way that the story continues because Nathan doesn't just launch into this confrontation, right? He doesn't start with, you're a bad person and you did a bad thing and now bad things are going to happen to you. He starts with a story. Because what we're going to find is that confrontation is not about expressing anger. Confrontation should not be an outlet for emotion. Emotions will come up, that's true. But confrontation is about reconciliation. Let me say that again. Confrontation is about reconciliation. That's what it should be. It's about putting things back together. And so before you consider confronting someone about something, you have to check your motivation. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Now, Nathan, he shows David his sin in a different context. He tells a story. Because you see, confrontation is a really tricky thing. Each situation calls for a different tact. I can't tell you how it's going to go every single time you try to confront someone because each time it's a little bit different. But what I can tell you is that if you want to make the difference in the life of your friend, you have to find a way to be heard. You have to find a way to make sure that they are hearing what you are saying. Truly listen to it. And so Nathan tells a story. He comes at it from a different angle. He tells this story in verse 2. He says, there were two men from a certain city. One was rich and the other poor. And the rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and his children. It used to eat from his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock and herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. And so he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. See, we've got this story where you got a rich man and a poor man. The rich man's got lots of stuff. He's got lots of sheep. He's got a whole flock of sheep. But the tradition was in this time, if somebody comes to visit you, you're supposed to kill one of the sheep and prepare a feast, right? You entertain your guest when you have a traveler who comes and stays with you. And now this rich man, even though he has hundreds of sheep, he doesn't want to use one of his sheep. He's like, I got this nice flock. I don't want to mess with that. So he takes the poor man's sheep, the only sheep that the poor man has, and he kills it, and he offers it to this traveler as, his thing. And David is furious about this in the story. It says in verse 5, then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who's done this deserves to die. David is so outraged at this injustice that has happened. And then Nathan hits him with it in verse 7. Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel. I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why? Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and taken his wife to be your wife. You have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Nathan lays it all out there very specifically, right? And when David sees his sin, he repents. Nathan identifies a specific problem. You did this thing, and it was wrong. And David realizes his error, and he repents. In verse 13, we get that repentance. It says, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Now, a couple things on that. First, David sinned against a lot of people, right? Bathsheba, Uriah, and then he brought other people into it, like his military leader Joab and the messengers who went and got Bathsheba. He's got lots of people to apologize to. But what verse 13 tells us is that it's not just about the people here on this earth. Sin hurts God. All right, there is a vulnerability in every relationship. This might be the most incredible part about what God does for us. He opens himself up to being hurt by us. When we sin against other people, we hurt the heart of God. When we hurt other people, we hurt God. So when we restore that relationship with other people, we have to restore the relationship with God as well. Every time I get in a fight with somebody, I get in a big fight with somebody and we'll reconcile, we'll work it out, we get back together, and we apologize, put things back together. I always try to make sure I say a prayer to God as well. And it usually goes like this: God, I am so sorry for hurting my buddy like that. I did not love him the way that you taught me to love. And that's my bad. That's my failure. I failed you, and I'm so sorry for hurting you. Please forgive me. Amen. Now there's one more piece to the story that I want to point out. The child dies. David and Bathsheba, they become pregnant. Bathsheba becomes pregnant, and she gives birth to the child, and the child dies. David repents, but that does not remove the consequences. I love a good Disney movie as much as the next person. But when you say sorry in the real world, everything doesn't just magically put itself back together. Restoring a relationship doesn't mean we don't have to live with the ripples of our sin. Confrontation, reconciliation, repentance, those are great things, all aimed at the future. But it does not erase the past. It takes away our eternal punishment after death. But in this life, we may have to live with the consequences of our actions. You see, one of the biggest things I want to leave you with today is that judgment is God's job. Our job is confrontation. The good news this morning is that God is the good and perfect and righteous judge. And the even better news is that we are not. We are not the judge. We shouldn't do that. We leave judgment to God. But that's sort of a catch-22. If our job is confrontation, I mean, even in love, how could I confront someone without first making some sort of judgment? I mean, how do I know what to confront them about if I'm not holding them up against some kind of standard? And this is a huge back and forth in our society. On the one hand, we bemoan the descent, how do I phrase it? Society's descent into immoral chaos. We don't even want to watch the news anymore. It is so sad and heartbreaking. You see the next school shooting and the next terrible thing, and we bemoan that. We're so sad about that. And yet, on the other hand, we are committed to the idea that my business is my business, and that makes it none of yours. Don't get in my face about that, right? In this church, nothing is more controversial than the idea of accountability. I have gotten more negative comments and negative feedback when I talk about accountability, confessing to one another, or speaking the truth in love than any other topic. And that includes the LGBTQ stuff of General Conference 2019. I thought that would be the hot button topic. And it's a hot button. But I got more negative feedback when I said I think we need to confess to each other and hold each other accountability. And nobody nope. Simply put, this church does not like confronting one another. And so I got to thinking about that. And I wondered why are we so hesitant to open ourselves up to each other? And I thought, well, maybe it's been done poorly in the past. Maybe we were raised in a church that was very different than the church we're in now. And we used to judge each other and hate on each other and use accountability as a way to hate people. And I think about the way it has been done in the past, and then I thought about my behavior in the last couple of months. And I thought about the issue of the LGBTQ inclusion from General Conference 2019. For those who don't know, there was a General Conference back in February. And they did a big vote on whether to change the language or not. And they chose not to change the language. And the whiplash, the response from the liberal side, from the progressive Methodists, was significant. There was, out of this heartbreak and anguish, people were crying out. They were so upset. Some of my friends who are pastors on the more liberal end of things, they were so heartbroken and that they put up their walls. And they lashed out at other people. And I'm on the conservative side for this one issue, and I hate choosing sides, but that's where I'm at. And I felt like I was attacked. And I felt like suddenly people were calling me a bigot, and they were calling me hateful. And so I put my defenses up, and I lashed out again. And I made a mistake in that moment. As your pastor, I missed an opportunity, and so I want to take a second to apologize. There was an opportunity there for us to figure out how to talk to each other. But because of my insecurity, because I was afraid that I needed to pick a side, I needed to establish myself and tell you what I thought, I was so concerned with that, I missed the opportunity to teach you as your pastor how to have this conversation. Because deeper than this one issue, there is a failure to have those conversations. All right, if it wasn't this issue, we'd be fighting about something else. And so I missed that opportunity, and I am so sorry. I'm not sorry for what I believe. I know what I believe, and I believe it for good biblical reasons. And I respect people who disagree with me, and I love you so much. But in that moment, I failed you. And so I am sorry. And I think moving forward, I really hope that we can focus on how to have those conversations, that we can learn to be vulnerable with one another and love each other and hold one another accountable in those moments. Learn to trust each other, to give each other the benefit of the doubt, to learn how to hold one another accountable in love. Because simply put, we just don't like confronting one another. And that approach has led to this mentality of you can do whatever you want as long as you keep it over there. Right? Keep your sin to yourself, and that makes it okay. I'll just ignore it, pretend like I don't see it. And that has led to this very self-centered church where we don't look at one another. We don't talk to one another. We don't love each other the way we should. We talked about this last week. That's not how sin works. Sin spreads like an infection. It spreads like pollution. It's not fair that what this guy does affects all the people around him, but that's the reality. That's how it works, okay? Sin creates ripples, and it affects the entire environment. It is never an isolated event. No matter how isolated and private your business might be, it affects the people around you. And so the answer to the catch-22 of confronting people without judging them, it all comes down to your motivation. Why are you doing this? You have to ask yourself, why are you confronting someone? Because if you are confronting someone because you are angry, that's no good. If you're confronting someone because you want to make them feel guilty, that's no good. But here's the big one. If you are confronting someone in order to make them apologize to you, you ever had that conversation? Right? Hey, I'm really sorry about this thing I did. Good. If all you want to do is hear them say they're sorry, you are missing the most important piece of confrontation. Repentance is about reconciliation. It's about restoring relationships. If you're confronting someone for the wrong reason, if your motivation is off, it's going to come off as judgment. But if you are confronting someone out of love, out of a deep caring for them, then it's going to come out with your eyes on reconciliation. It's going to come out a lot like loving them. One of my favorite parts of the two scriptures for today is that they are so practical. The challenge for us today is to learn how to confront one another in love. And so there's two parts to this, the who and the how. So first, let's talk about the who. Who are we supposed to confront? I know some people might say, well, anybody who's doing something wrong. There are not enough hours in the day nor days in the week for you to confront every single person on this earth who is doing something wrong, right? Nor should you. Some people think we need to confront our enemies. You know, the people who are sinning, we need to show them their sin and then drag them back to God. Real quick, close your eyes for a second. I want each of you, you're going to open them in a sec, don't nod off. Close your eyes for a second. I want each of you to think of someone who does something that bothers you. Someone who does something that you disagree with. I don't care if it's extreme, like terrorists or pop music stars, homosexuals, people who are homophobic. I don't care. Someone who you disagree with. Now, you can open your eyes if you want, but I want you to keep that person fixed in your mind. They are living in such a way that you find it offensive. You disagree with their life choices. In fact, you are butting heads with this person. Now, for argument's sake, I want you to keep thinking of that person. Let's assume it's not just a disagreement. Let's assume that you are right and they are wrong, that they are sinning, that they are evil. Let's push it all the way to the extreme. They are your enemy. How does Jesus tell us to treat our enemies? You will love them. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's Matthew chapter 5. See, the thing about confronting your enemies is they don't listen. You are not in a good place to confront them. We don't listen to people who start with judgment. We don't listen to people who start with, I hate you and I think you're wrong. We walk away from those people. Somebody walks up to you in the parking lot and says that to you, you're not going to listen. We don't listen to people who start with, I hate you and you're wrong. It is our friends that we listen to. We are so willing to identify the faults in the people we are least likely to reach. Effective confrontation comes from those closest to home. Matthew 18 lays it out very specifically, and I would go so far as to say, it says that you have to confront members of your church, and that's it. You got to stop expecting non-Christians to behave like Christians. They don't have the same value system. They don't believe the same things that we do. We bring them to Christ, and then we hold them to the same. You can't expect them to behave your way, because that's not how it works. Which means that our responsibility of confrontation lies most heavily with the people we are the closest to, our friends, the people whose faults we usually ignore. We overlook them because they're our friends. And if you still want to confront your enemies, if you still feel that desire to confront someone who you think is disagreeing, you have to love them first. You have to. You get to know them, have lunch with them, show them that your motivation is love and not judgment. All right, you show that that's Jesus' model. That's how he did it. Zacchaeus, I'm not going to start with you're a bad person. I'm going to start with let's have lunch. Let's get to know them. and you will be more effective at reaching people. So that is the who of confrontation. If you're going to confront someone, you have to confront the people you love. Okay? Our culture has it all backwards, don't they? We overlook the faults of the people closest to us, and we magnify our enemies' faults. That's how it works, right? To quote Star Wars, this is how we win, dummy. By saving what we love, not by killing what we hate, by saving what we love. Ignoring someone's sin does not make you a good friend. When I was a youth pastor in Chicago, I had a young girl come up to me after one of the games that we were playing, and she said, she asked to speak with me privately. And she told me she was scared for her friends because they were starting to experiment with drugs. I think they were stealing from their parents, just grabbing pills and stuff. She was 13 years old. And she told me she didn't want to talk to her friends about it because she didn't want to seem like a bad friend. Right? She didn't want to be the tattletale, which is not the word she used. She didn't want to be a bad friend. I had another girl in high school who asked me what she should do about her friends who were starting to hurt themselves with razors. They're starting to experiment with self-harm, and she wanted to know, what do I do? And so to both girls, these are absolutely true stories, I'm just not telling you their names. To both girls, I asked them, is it more loving to watch your friends hurt themselves? Or is it more loving to talk to them about it, to confront them even if you lose that friendship? Is it more loving to confront them? And I said, I'm willing. I will talk to them. I'd be happy to do that for you, but it's not going to be as effective coming from me because I don't know them. You got to talk to them. And so then I gave them the formula for compassionate confrontation with this Matthew chapter 18. And it says, if another member of the church, remember I said, member of the church, people in this house, member of the church sins against you, you can go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. And if the member listens to you, you have regained that one. Do you feel that emphasis on the goal is reconciliation? The goal is to regain them, not to prove how bad they are, not to make them feel guilty, not to make them feel bad, to regain them. And then it says, but if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. And if the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. For a long time, when I was in college, I was walking to class, and outside one of the campus buildings, there was a guy brandishing a Bible and a megaphone. Any ideas where I'm going with this? And he was waving that Bible around, telling us all how we were terrible people, and we were all going to hell, and he was just shouting and screaming. I was on a Christian college campus. Most of those kids, like 90% of those kids were Christian. And he's out there yelling and shouting, and all I could think was, man, that is the least effective way to reach somebody. If anything, he probably pushed a bunch of people farther away from God. He didn't do what he had set out to do. I mentioned earlier that every situation of confrontation deserves special attention. To be effective, each moment requires a unique approach, and there are better and worse ways to do it. The passage in Matthew gives us a very simple formula for how to confront someone in private, by yourself. And if that doesn't work, bring other people, other members of the family of God who also love this person. We got to invest in each other together, right? And so other members of the family, each confrontation takes a unique approach. And we are more likely to know what approach that is if you know them. The better you know the person. We are the most effective in confrontation with the people who are the closest to us. Those are the people who listen to us. And then at the very end, it says, if they still won't listen to you, let them be as a Gentile or a tax collector to you. Now, historically, churches have used that line to excommunicate people, to kick them out if they're not listening to you, right? They're not going to pay attention to the church, when we should just kick them out. Gentiles and tax collectors, get them out of the church. But let me ask you, what did Jesus do with Gentiles and tax collectors? That's where he built his church, right there, right? If Jesus had given up and pushed those people out, there would be no church. And so the last thing I want to say is just, if confrontation fails, if you've gone and you've talked to your brother and sister in love and there's no reconciliation, don't push those people out of your life. Right? You're not done with those people. Jesus loved those people, and he kept working to bring them back in a good relationship with him. We want to keep our environment free of sin. That's true, all right? That's a reality that we want. But that's not the same thing as giving up on people and pushing them away. When my mother took that fork from me, I did not electrocute myself. That that high school girl whose friends were starting to hurt themselves, they started going to counseling after she talked to them. The middle school girl didn't fare as well. She talked to her friends. And when her friends didn't listen, she went and talked to the parents. And her friends were furious. They didn't want to hang out with her anymore. It was a couple of years before those friendships got repaired. But those girls graduated high school without being addicted to anything. So I'm going to call that a win. All right, that was so hard for her. I was so proud of her. That was so challenging for her to stand up to her friends like that. And we supported her every step of the way. We were like, I'm so sorry. We're hugging her when she was crying about losing those friends. But she helped those people. Confrontation is not always a happy feeling event. But in the light of the restoration of a relationship, in the light of putting together two broken pieces of a heart, is there anything that should stand in our way? And so I'll leave you with this. May you leave judgment to God. May you learn to confront one another in love, and may God be with you every step of the way. Amen.